Well, we have the College Football Hall of Fame class, and we want to talk about the three biggest names and the three biggest takeaways. Now, of course, this isn't diminishing anybody else in this class, just a little bit of a precursor to the segment we're going to do a little bit later. But there's three names that I personally just really want to talk about that stand out to me. Alabama, they are throwing money at quarterback, or they were throwing money at quarterback Carson Beck. Does this mean Alabama's desperate, and where do they go from there? Lou Holtz is back at it again. He's over here tweeting, and we're going to discuss that over there. And then also an assistant who was a finalist for the Broyles Award for the best assistant in college football got extended. We want to talk about that as well. But if you guys are new around here, I would really appreciate it if you like and or subscribe for sure. I would really appreciate it. And if you're not sure if you really should be subscribing or liking this video, then stick around. See if I got something of value to talk about. But the one thing you can definitely do that's not going to hurt you, me, or anybody else, you can comment down below your thoughts on any of the topics we talk about today or any college football topics that you want tackled in the comment section, with it being featured on a video potentially in the future. So make sure you guys comment down below, number one thing for sure, because I will be interactive in there, especially if TikTok's going away. If TikTok's going away, first off, before it does, make sure you check out what I do over there. But second off, TikTok's going away, with or without it, I want to make YouTube a priority for me this year, and that's going to happen for sure. It is in my focus right now at the moment with TikTok still around, and if TikTok's gone, I guess I'm pivoting in the right direction anyway. All right, let's talk about some college football. That's what you came here for. You didn't come here for me. You came here for the discussion on college football, and I am the host of that here today. All right, the Hall of Fame class. Urban Meyer is the first name that's going to get brought up. And me being from Columbus, an Ohio State guy growing up, you know, the 2014 National Championship, I was only 13 years old, 14 years old when that season was playing out. And it was magical, truly magical. Not as magical now because, truth be told, I do try to cover this as a lover of the sport of college football, not just an obsessed Ohio State fan. It still feels pretty nice that they're there, and it's also a little bit weirder because Ohio State lost to Michigan. But with all that being said, that was magical back then. Take yourself back to whatever fan you are of, whatever team you're a fan of. And if they have had their best years, their peak years, or even if they didn't, just imagine how amazing that would have been through your young teenage years as a kid who fantasized about that. Even as an older kid, you could possibly be fantasizing about playing at that type of level. Urban Meyer provided that for me. So for me personally, I'm always going to be grateful for the memories that Urban Meyer brought. But he's on here, and it's not without controversy. All the controversy that he had dealt with. When you're talking about his legacy, starting out at Bowling Green as a head coach, of course, position coach, and working his way up the ranks like any other coach, Bowling Green has success, parlays that over to Utah. Undefeated regular season, parlays that after giving the job, by the way, to Kyle Whittingham. He goes off to Florida and an underwhelming 2005 season. His second year at 2006, he was able to get it going over at Florida. And he had success over at Florida with the national championship early on. In 2007, they took a downslide, but in 2008, they went back and won the national championship, went on a tear after that Ole Miss game, including beating in a 1-2 matchup in the SEC championship game. I believe it was 1-2. Alabama. It might have been 2-3. I think that one was 2-3, but you can correct me however you want in the comment section below. They win the national championship against Oklahoma in 2008, and then they go and they run the table in 2009, setting up a number 1 versus number 2 matchup in the SEC championship, a rematch from the previous year against Alabama. And Alabama absolutely put it on them, just put it on them. And it was not really that competitive of a football game. Tim Tebow, the image of him crying in his last game in the SEC, it was really a moment frozen in time for me as a little kid at that point. And I remember Tim Tebow crying. As crazy as that sounds, I remember me and my mother watching it together. And Alabama goes on and wins their first national championship, and we'll talk a first national championship with Nick Saban, and we'll talk about that guy in a second. But after that, Urban Meyer takes his hiatus from Florida, comes back in 2010, has his health issues pop up, win his final game against Penn State in the bowl game in 2010, while Penn State has a bunch of stuff starting to come up for them. And Urban Meyer steps down, and he takes 2011 off. Well, coincidentally, in 2011, Ohio State, his home state school, the school he grew up rooting for, and the school that he really learned from. He learned from Earl Bruce. They had an interim coach. They went 6-7. Ironically, lost to his former team in the Gator Bowl, the Florida Gators. That was the last game before Urban Meyer took the head coaching job, or before Urban Meyer was officially the head coach, I should say. Urban Meyer takes over thinking that there will not be NCAA sanctions, and boom, they smack the sanctions, but Ohio State goes 12-0 in that season despite that, and they were a flawed team, but they still were able to win their games. 12-0 through that regular season, 12-0 through the 2013 season. He started out 24-0. He lost 3 of his next 4 games, however, losing in the Big Ten Championship to Michigan State, losing to Clemson in the bowl game, and then after beating Navy in game 1, losing to Virginia Tech in 2014. Started to get a little bit doom and gloom around Columbus, maybe some people unsure. Everybody could recognize that things were different because star quarterback Braxton Miller got hurt in the preseason. But then JT Barrett and that team gained their confidence throughout the season, and they got better and better. And JT Barrett vaulted his way into the Heisman conversation before he got hurt against arch rival Michigan. And in a 3-game run, unlike anything you've ever seen in college football. 59-0 against Wisconsin when they were outside the top 4, set the tone as they won the Big Ten, made such an emphatic statement that the College Football Playoff Committee had no choice but to vault them into the playoff as a 12-1 champ. And sure enough, they made the playoff, beat Alabama, beat Oregon, and wins a national championship like I opened with this segment. Magical for me as a kid, and I am always going to be grateful for Urban Meyer with that. Though he did not win another national championship, his record, his rest of his time at Ohio State was impeccable, brilliant. 12-1 in 2015, 11-2 in 2016, 12-2 in 2017, and 12-1 or 13-1, pardon me, in 2018, his last year. Now, granted, he was suspended for the first 3 games of that season because of accusations against disgraced former assistant Zach Smith. It was also a situation where that was Earl Bruce's grandson, and a lot of people accused of nepotism. And there was a big mess there. And Zach Smith has a podcast right now. Language barrier for sure there if you are somebody that's over here that likes family-friendly content. But if language is not something that you mind, he's got a podcast. I would go look him up if you don't mind that stuff. It's Menace to Sports. He definitely does a good job when it comes to talking about college football. He does film breakdowns. But disgraced coach and all that drama and stuff, it eventually led to Urban Meyer having, I guess, another escape plan. And similar to Utah, he had a guy on staff that he had confidence in, and that's how we get Ryan Day. And that's the last time we see Urban Meyer in college football. Of course, he had some stuff going on in the NFL. He took the job with the Jaguars, didn't even finish a full season before getting fired, had a situation where he kicked a kicker, and after a Thursday night football game in Cincinnati, he went up to Columbus, left the team. He got caught at his own bar, getting a little handsy and frisky, I guess, with some girl, and that was not Shelly Meyer, and he's definitely disgraced across college football. He's a polarizing figure. But you cannot deny that Urban Meyer is one of the greatest head football coaches of the new generation, of my generation. Growing up in college football, there were 2 guys, Nick Saban and Urban Meyer. Even when he was at Florida, it was Nick Saban and Urban Meyer. That's the reality that we live in. Now let's talk about Nick Saban. Nick Saban, legend, legendary coach, the greatest coach of all time. It did not take long. Nick Saban gets his stuff started smaller and smaller. He tries out the NFL. That's all a part of it. There are, I guess, a little bit of lessons to be learned from Nick Saban. career, really. And that the ups and the downs from Nick Saban's career is very interesting to me. He wasn't a bad coach by any stretch of the imagination by Michigan at Michigan State. In fact, he did well enough where he could get the LSU job, but it definitely wasn't anything where you'd be like, oh, wow. Like if you ask any Michigan State fans, they're definitely going to praise Mark D'Antonio a whole lot more as a head football coach than Nick Saban of their school. But he gets to LSU. He has a lot of talent. In 2003, has the BCS national championship. He wins his first national championship, spends a few more years over there at LSU, and then he tries to leave for the NFL. He goes over to the Miami Dolphins, a very short stint. It did not go super duper well, but it also was not a big disaster the same way that Urban Meyer's NFL experience was a disaster. He ends up getting the Alabama job. Alabama, won national championship in the 90s, but they had longed for the days of Bear Bryant. And boy, did they get the days of Bear Bryant. 2007, his first year at Alabama, was definitely a little bit of a rough year. But 2008, things started to turn up. They lose to Florida in that SEC championship. 2009, they get their revenge, and they complete a perfect season in 2009. They win the national championship, beat Texas after Colt McCoy gets hurt, but they did what they could do. They won the national championship. 2010, they took a step backwards while Cam Newton and Auburn took a step forward, and they had the Cam back in Tuscaloosa the last time that the Auburn Tigers were able to win in Tuscaloosa. And the last time they were able to win in Tuscaloosa because of this guy. Because after that point, they didn't have another year like that under Nick Saban. 2011, avenged their only loss of the regular season, beating LSU in the national championship. 2012, absolutely taking it to Notre Dame. They lost on the kick six in 2013. I know they're not winning the national championship every single year. They had won 3 of 4, but finally they're not winning the national championship. They end up losing to Auburn on the kick six, and then kind of an under-motivated team lost to Trevor Knight in the Oklahoma Sooners in the Sugar Bowl. But they definitely responded. They lost one game to Ole Miss in a thriller in Oxford, but then they ended up going and being the 1 seed in the college football playoff and getting beat by an Ohio State team that was on an absolutely magical run. But that was still an amazing team. And if they find a way to pull off that victory, and they were leading for a good part of that whole first half, like they were leading, and they were right there with Ohio State, even with the heat and the lightning in the bottle that Ohio State caught that year, they were still right there with them. In 2015, they ended up getting it right, though they lost to Ole Miss, and they had a ton of turnovers there. Second consecutive loss to a cheating Hugh Freeze and Ole Miss. They end up going and winning the national championship. Jake Coker, one of the more underrated quarterbacks in college football in my generation. Jake Coker led a pretty productive offense, and Derrick Henry won the Heisman Trophy, and they go on and they beat Clemson in an absolute thriller. And that's where we get that little run of Clemson versus Alabama. 2016, Clemson versus Alabama lose at the last second in the national championship. 2017, win in overtime against Georgia when Georgia first broke onto the scene. Guys, we're talking about Nick Saban's career. This was his 11th season. He won 5 national championships: 09, 11, 12, 15, and 17. 5 national championships, and it looked like they were going to do it in 2018. Things did not come together for them. Ran off the field against a Clemson team that was really on fire that night. 2019, they missed the playoffs with arguably the best wide receiver core that's ever been at Alabama, and they lose to LSU in a classic. They lose to Auburn in a classic. They end up making 2020 one of the greatest offensive seasons we have ever seen, and that was the 6th and final national championship for Nick Saban. He closes out his career with 3 seasons that are still really, really good. Makes the playoff in 21, loses to Georgia, pick 6 that really sealed the game by Keely Ringo, and then 22, they took a little bit of a step back, had 2 last-second losses against LSU and Tennessee. Still were ranked number 5, by the way, in America. Put it to Kansas State and Will Howard, by the way, in the bowl game. And then in 2023, played an all-time classic in the Rose Bowl in Nick Saban's final game, losing to eventual national champion Michigan. That's a lot. That is a lot because Nick Saban is the GOAT. This is going to take a little bit less time. Mike Vick really brought a lot of shine to the Virginia Tech program, a team that is not traditionally a power. Frank Beamer gets a lot of credit for vaulting Virginia Tech into this realm that is at the top of the sport of college football. They make the 1999 BCS National Championship that would have been played in 2000, but they lose to Florida State, who at the time were not in the same conference. Virginia Tech, Big East, and Big East Offensive Player of the Year. In third place in the Heisman was Michael Vick. Super electrifying as a quarterback. He was really the biggest reason why that Virginia Tech team made the run to the national championship in the first place to get to that point. Congratulations to all these men on getting into the College Football Hall of Fame, even if there's controversy behind, a couple of these dudes, because there was controversy with Mike Vick, though that was in his pro days, in his pro career. All of these guys, it's much deserved, and they brought college football a ton of joy, and I'm excited for you guys, and as well as all of the inductees in the 2025 class. We're going to talk about Nick Saban's former school, though, here. Alabama, their next steps going forward for Kalen DeBoer, and the first thing I got to ask here, just floating this out there. Ryan Grubb was his offense coordinator over at Washington, right? He was supposed to come with Kalen DeBoer to Alabama and then ended up getting the NFL offer. It didn't work out for him up there, but he didn't exactly, pan out in the NFL, but he was going to be his guy. And Ryan Grubb had basically been with Kalen DeBoer all his career. Nick Sheridan had basically been with Kalen DeBoer all his career. Does this sound like somebody? Because this, to me, is starting to sound and be reminiscent for Kalen DeBoer as Dabo Swinney with his assistants. When he had to replace Brent Venables and Tony Elliott, he dove right into what he was comfortable with. The guys he's been around for years. Brandon Streeter and Wes Goodwin. Absolute failure. Especially Brandon Streeter. I'm not saying Nick Sheridan was a complete failure, but the offense was definitely missing something. And then, quite frankly, even under Nick Saban, you get into this rhythm, and I mentioned it when talking about Georgia yesterday. Alabama is in this routine where they keep hiring these pass-happy or pass-game addict coordinators. Bill O'Brien, very heavy on the pass game, was at Penn State, was in the NFL, wanted to lean on that a little bit, though in the NFL it's a little bit different. He also had Arian Foster in the beginning of his tenure in Houston, I believe, at least. And Bill O'Brien, when he was at Alabama, definitely erred on the side of throwing the football, and they had the weapons to do so. Jamison Williams, John Mechie, etc., down the list, and Bryce Young, of course, won the Heisman in 2021. And then when Bill O'Brien leaves, they go and they hire Tommy Rees, a former quarterback who brought Tyler Buckner with them. And, they ended up working it out to where Jalen Milroe was the guy. But clearly Tommy Rees, it wasn't working there. But, of course, that was the last year of Saban with Tommy Rees last season in 23. Now we get to Kalen DeBoer, and it's a lot of the same stuff. You knew Kalen DeBoer would lean more into the throw game as the Alabama coach. But the thing is it's not like Kalen DeBoer has not had a successful run game. He had a pretty successful run game with Dylan Johnson at Washington when they went to the national championship and played Michigan. So can Kalen DeBoer really fix this? I think he can. And it's not like the Dabo Swinney comparison is nearly the same, too, because he did go out and hire, in my opinion, a really good coach in Kane Womack from South Alabama who had success over there to be his defensive coordinator. So it's not exactly identical. And the other thing that the comparison between the two might be a little bit flawed, they're trying to attack the portal for a quarterback. They offered... There are rumors about, I don't even know how much, there are rumors about several different numbers that were out there, but they offered a substantial amount of money to Carson Beck when he was in the portal prior to him publicly committing to Miami. And the question that is going to be raised is Alabama desperate for a quarterback? My answer is no. What they probably saw is what a lot of NFL guys are going to see and why they're going to fall in love with Carson Beck as a prospect and why Shannon Dawson in Miami really wanted to get Carson Beck. It's because he's got a live arm and he's got a lot of potential and he's got experience in the SEC. Listen, I don't think Kalen DeBoer is necessarily uncomfortable with the idea of going with one of the younger guys, whether it's Austin Mack or Keelan Russell ends up taking the reins next year. I mean, you never know, especially with the high level of high school football that Keelan Russell played. You never know if he can eventually be the starter next year. I assume game one, that's not going to be the plan. But what I'm saying here is, though Alabama offered that amount of money, don't have the misconception that Alabama really, really desperately needed to get Carson Beck, because I don't believe that's the truth. I think they thought it would be nice to get the former quarterback from an SEC rival who has 2 years of starting experience in the SEC that can work with Kalen DeBoer in that offense. And who knows, maybe Ryan Grubb's going to come back. That could have been a really good fit. But I think Kalen DeBoer, there's a reason why he plucked Austin Mack from Washington and took him with him. I think he has a belief in the kid. I think he has a belief that Keelan Russell could be a really good player. And maybe they have somebody else on roster that could also be a good player. I know Dylan Lonergan left. That shows that Austin Mack or somebody else is probably really good. You saw last year, Eli Holstein, after Nick Saban retired, he left too. So I don't think Alabama is desperate, but you're going to have a first-time starter more than likely at quarterback next year. So it's a lot of the similar things that I talked about with Georgia. They need to find a way to reestablish dominance on the ground. Just a little bit. And if I'm Nick Saban, I'm calling him up and telling him that. If I'm somebody with influence on Kalen DeBoer, I'm telling him, hey, buy your quarterback a little bit of time. I know you've done a good job in the past with Michael Penix in particular, both at Indiana and Washington. He did a good job with Jake Haener in that throw game out at Fresno State as the head coach. But they're going to have to lean on that run game. And they did lose one of their top running backs, and a lot of Alabama fans debated which one was better, Jam Miller or Justice Haynes. Well, there's no debate right now. Justice Haynes is gone. He went to Michigan, left you high and dry. He's not happy with the run game that has been put in front of him. They need to be able to establish that as a dominant factor in the SEC because, in my opinion, I don't think these SEC teams are winning national championships because they're not as effective running the football. Tennessee got mollywopped against Ohio State after Dylan Sampson went down and they couldn't establish the run game in that game. Texas, in big moments this year, really could not run the football. In Georgia, other than a half of football against Texas in the second half of the SEC championship, against good defenses, has not been able to run the football. Nobody in the SEC has really been a dominant rushing team this year, and I think that's a big thing that the SEC needs to get back to because Notre Dame can really pound that rock. Penn State could really pound that rock too, and they took Notre Dame to the wire. And Ohio State, they have their moments where they're really good on the ground too. Establish that balance. Find your run game a little bit, and that throw game will come with some time with a first-year starter in what I project to be Austin Mack next year. I think that Alabama will be fine next year. I think they're going to be really, really good. But Kalen DeBoer is at a nice little point right now where if he doesn't make the right decisions and the right calls as the head coach of that football program, Alabama could continuously be on this bubble range of the college football playoff instead of a lock to be in the 12-team playoff the way that they would have been most years under Saban. I think that's what Alabama fans want, is just to simply be comfortably in the 12-team playoff every single year. They don't – I think they've adjusted by now with – now you're going to go 4 straight seasons without winning a national championship. I think Alabama fans have adjusted, and they're really like, okay, we don't need to win it every single year, obviously. We would like for you to win it, but we don't need to necessarily win it every single year, but we need a little bit better of a product than what we got this year. And a lot more consistent of a product than what Alabama got this year. Hey, Lou Holtz is back tweeting, guys. I don't know who's in charge of Lou Holtz's Twitter, by the way, because the tweet that he posted the other day is definitely a different tune that he was saying in a video that I saw earlier today of him talking about the national championship game. But don't let this media mess get a bunch of you. Oh, I wonder where Lou Holtz is right now. That's not going to happen again, obviously. Ryan Day was asked about it, and it was just a simple no. He was asked if he had talked to Lou Holtz since then. No. That's the simple answer. This is a big nothing burger to me, but it's fun to talk about because Lou Holtz, it's a good college football meme, to be quite honest with you. And it's fun, especially sitting here as an Ohio State fan who is very objective about college football. I find it hilarious. I really do. It's going to be a big nothing burger at the end of the day. It's not going to have a big impact, but I'm super excited to see the memes on if Ohio State wins the national championship on Monday night, the memes about what Ryan Day would be saying to Lou Holtz. And I'm assuming Lou Holtz is going to talk his smack if Notre Dame does end up winning on Monday night. So if I wasn't a Buckeye fan, I'm not going to lie to you. For the jokes and the memes, I would probably be on the Notre Dame side, but, I have an allegiance. I'm from Columbus. Take it how it is. Ohio State's a super tough football team this year, and you're not going to hear Lou Holtz saying that same stuff because the last 2 seasons, that ain't been the reason why Ohio State's lost games. Toughness has not been the problem for Ohio State. Just look at that Texas game, man. They were physically dominant basically all game long, and the only thing that was standing in their way of blowing the doors wide open, penalties, in my opinion. Texas played a great game offensively, especially throwing the football. But with that being said, I still think that Ohio State team is really, really tough, and you're not going to hear the same type of criticism from Lou Holtz. The worst you're going to hear is they might be a tough team now, but they're just not tougher than Notre Dame. I'm not doing a Lou Holtz voice. You're not catching me do that here live on air. Quinn Ewers is going off to the NFL draft, and the impact that Quinn Ewers has made in college football is pretty significant. He really established going to Ohio State, reclassifying early, and getting publicity on how much money he was making from NIL deals. He really made it a reality for high school players to quickly get paid after being a star recruit. He was definitely a disappointment for having the perfect rating on 247 Sports with Steve Wilfong there and having the more resources at that time than On3. And now, of course, On3 is probably the superior site for recruiting. But Quinn Ewers definitely made an impact on that NIL world. And I think you would be naive to not admit that. Quinn Ewers, when he came out and he took all that money, that's really the first big story you can go back to. The first time that we could see a kid come straight from high school and he reclassified to do so and take advantage of NIL right off the bat before taking a snap. And the only snaps he took for Ohio State that year was garbage time handoffs against Michigan State in a 56-7 game. Quinn Ewers, though, what he showed on tape against Ohio State, I think, is definitely something that NFL teams are going to be optimistic in. And I think that there's somebody in the late round of the draft, I'm eyeballing the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Seattle Seahawks in particular, somebody in the later rounds of that draft, they're going to take him in the first or later picks in the first round of that draft. They're going to take him in the first round of the draft. So Quinn Ewers leaving for the NFL, not a mistake whatsoever. In my opinion, if it wasn't for the UCL injury, Carson Beck would have also not made a mistake if he would have decided to do that. Because Quinn Ewers, after all the draft talk and the craziness that goes around that, Quinn Ewers is going to be a first-round pick. I firmly believe that, and if I'm wrong, you can come back to this video. Make sure you comment down below if you agree with me that Quinn Ewers is going to be a first-round pick. I truly think he will. Texas with Arch Manning is definitely going to be the bigger story here, though. A lot of Texas fans are very optimistic that they're going to be able to vault to a different level with Arch Manning. But the only thing that, in my opinion, Arch Manning really needs to do is keep that progress going with Steve Sarkisian's program. He doesn't necessarily need to be much better than Quinn Ewers. He's going to have a different skill set, that's for sure. But for Texas, Arch Manning getting all this hype for you Texas fans out there. I don't care that he's a Manning. He probably welcomes the pressure, but don't be letting yourself down by putting way too much pressure and way too much stock into this kid being an automatic upgrade from Quinn Ewers. Because if you're a Texas fan and you don't trust Steve Sarkisian's judgment, I'm telling you, as somebody who's not a Texas fan whatsoever, I trust Steve Sarkisian's judgment. And Steve Sarkisian did not ever want to pull the trigger to make Arch Manning the starting quarterback this year for Texas. That should tell you something. I think there's a lot of pedigree behind what Steve Sarkisian says about quarterback play. And I think Arch Manning will be a really good player. And maybe he is an upgrade from Quinn Ewers, but I don't think he needs to be. I think Texas is at a good point with their program. And if Arch Manning ends up being an upgrade, that's just a blessing. If he ends up being a Heisman Trophy finalist or even a Heisman Trophy winner, that's just something beyond your wildest dreams because he doesn't need that to have success at a program like Texas. The final thing I want to talk about here is Tennessee. How about Tennessee football, man? They're going and extending Tim Banks, who has done a fantastic job, an absolutely fantastic job with that defense. Had an amazing defense in the SEC. I get it finished in a very sour way against Ohio State. I get it. But the way that Tennessee finished the season against Ohio State is still not going to do justice to the job that Tim Banks did. Tim Banks in the SEC had one of the top defenses in the country. Absolutely was able to turn around that secondary and make them very complementary to a disruptive pass rush. And they were really, really good all year long. This is the right decision for Tennessee to give him an extension, give him his money. And you're going to be able to count as a Tennessee fan that Tennessee defense is going to be much better next year. But the pressure turns and shifts now because the pressure after the 2022 season was, all right, we got to fix that defense. Tim Banks come in, fix that defense. And he was able to do it in pretty quick order, similar to Jim Knowles up at Ohio State. In the second year, Ohio State was a great defense. In the second year of Tim Banks after that 22 season, boy, Tennessee's defense really, really took off. But the pressure all season long for Ohio State last year was on Kyle McCord and that offense to really perform at the same clip. And they did not do that. Nico Iamaleava and that offense this year did not perform at that 2022 clip. And you're seeing with Ohio State this year, they go on and they might be winning the national championship on Monday. We'll see how that game goes. But Ohio State now has a very complementary team where they have a super dynamic offense and an absolutely imposing defense. That's the best of both worlds that Tennessee fans are looking for. And it's going to be up to Nico Iamaleava to take that next step. It is also going to be up to that wide receiver core to develop or Tennessee's transfers to really make an impact at that wide receiver position. They need to reestablish that Josh Heupel system in the passing attack, putting the defense in conflict, because Josh Heupel did show last year that they can be really, really effective running the ball as well. When you mix all those worlds together, brother, that's a recipe for a national championship. I'm not calling it saying Tennessee is going to win a national championship. I need to see it all come together. But in the last 3 seasons, we have seen pieces of Tennessee all come together and show traits at different times of complete teams. They need to be able to take the success that they had in 2022 and merge it with the success that they had on defense in 24 and try to put those two worlds together so that way they can be elevated and be in a conversation in mid to late January for a college football playoff national championship instead of getting ran off the field against Ohio State because, frankly, your offense couldn't keep up and your defense had so much pressure on them. I'll give it to Tennessee that Ohio State was playing on a different level that night offensively, but that offense needs to be able to win a game for the defense when the defense doesn't play super well. because every single year, you're always going to see one game from even the best defense in America where they're not playing their best ball. They're having an off night against a really good opponent. Happened with Ohio State this year, happened with Georgia in 2022. It happened in 21. The only team that was able to play a full 15-game season with dominant defense was Michigan, and they really had to win a national championship. Because say they would have had an off day against Ohio State or Alabama on defense, they would have lost either of those games, and they would not have been in the national championship. The margin for error was much less for Michigan because they didn't have that complementary offense. I think that Tennessee needs to find that complementary offense to the defense that was supposed to be complementary to the offense. Now they got to kind of change course here and find that offense, and the pressure is on Nico Iamaleava. Thank you guys for tuning in tonight. Really appreciate it, and I'll see you guys in the next